Imagine being stripped of your freedom, sentenced to a lifetime behind the cold, unforgiving walls of a prison where hope is the rarest commodity. But what if, even in the darkest of places, a light still flickered? This is the story of Andy Dufresne, a man who, despite being wrongly convicted, never let go of his belief in something greater, freedom. Not just the freedom of the body, but of the mind and spirit. Buckle up for a journey that will inspire you to believe in the impossible, because sometimes, the greatest prison isn't the one made of walls, but the one we create in our minds. In 1947, the peaceful town of Maine was shattered by a shocking murder. The prime suspect? Andy Dufresne, a local banker. Despite his adamant claims of innocence, the court found him guilty and sentenced him to 2 consecutive life sentences. Andy was sent to Shawshank Prison, a notorious institution known for breaking even the strongest of men. But sometimes, it's not the walls that break us, it's our own mindset. Andy may have been sent to Shawshank, but his greatest strength was something no prison could take from him: hope. Even as he walked through those iron gates, there was something about Andy that refused to let Shawshank defeat him. He knew that while he couldn't control the situation, he could control how he responded to it. His heart was unbreakable, a reminder that even in the darkest places, light can be found if you choose to create it. Meanwhile, Red, a convicted murderer, was serving his 20th year in Shawshank. He was up for parole, but despite his sincere attempts to prove he had changed, the parole board denied his request. Disheartened, Red returned to his routine in prison, which involved smuggling contraband for other inmates in exchange for money. Red had been in Shawshank long enough to understand that the prison had its own ways of crushing spirits. Yet, when Andy entered, Red sensed something different about him. There was a quiet strength to Andy, something that intrigued Red, as though Andy had a secret source of resilience that kept him going. When a new group of prisoners arrived at Shawshank, Red and his friends made bets on who would crack first under the immense pressure of prison life. Red wagered on Andy. On the surface, Andy seemed calm and composed, but deep inside, he harbored profound despair. However, it wasn't Andy who broke down on the first night, it was an obese inmate who cried uncontrollably. The man's cries caught the attention of Captain Hadley, a sadistic guard who enjoyed brutalizing the prisoners. Hadley mercilessly beat the man for hours, leaving him in the infirmary. The next morning, the inmates learned that the man had died from his injuries because the prison doctor was unavailable that night. This shocked Andy, and while others chose to ignore it, Andy tried to ask about the man's name, but the others told him to mind his own business. This moment taught Andy a powerful lesson: sometimes, the world will tell you to stay quiet, to keep your head down. But Andy wasn't the kind of man who could easily accept such advice. He didn't just want to survive Shawshank, he wanted to retain the part of himself that the prison walls could never reach, his spirit. No matter how confined his circumstances, his soul remained free. A month passed, and one day Andy approached Red after hearing that he could smuggle items into the prison. Andy requested a rock hammer, claiming he wanted it for his hobby of collecting and sculpting rocks. Red, curious, wondered if Andy intended to use it to escape, but Andy laughed off the idea. This was typical of Andy, he never let his true intentions show too soon, but he always had a plan. Red agreed to help but warned Andy about the Sisters, a group of inmates led by Boggs who preyed on others. It soon became clear that Boggs had taken a liking to Andy. During his first few nights, Andy spent most of his time either working in the laundry or fending off attacks from Boggs and his gang. Despite the constant danger, Andy found solace in his friendship with Red. They passed the time discussing their dreams and hopes for the future. Because even in a place as harsh as Shawshank, Andy held on to something powerful, the belief that no matter how bleak life seemed, there was still room to dream, still room to hope. Andy's ability to find hope in the smallest moments, whether in conversation with a friend or in the simple act of chipping away at a rock, was his way of fighting back. His hope was his shield, protecting him from the despair that consumed so many. When a job opportunity arose to tar the roof of a prison building, Red pulled some strings to get Andy and their friends the job. One day, while they were working, Andy overheard Captain Hadley complaining about having to pay taxes on an upcoming inheritance. Drawing on his expertise as a banker, Andy suggested a way to legally shelter the money by turning it into a one-time gift for Hadley's wife. Andy even offered to help with the paperwork, in exchange for chilled beers for his fellow inmates. At first, the arrogant captain seemed angry, but when he realized Andy's intelligence, he accepted the deal. Over time, Andy built good relationships with the prison staff, becoming more comfortable and confident. He also took to reading, expanding his knowledge. Some time later, Andy approached Red again with an odd request. He wanted a poster of the actress Rita Hayworth. Red found the request strange but agreed without question. For Andy, the poster represented more than just a decoration for his cell. It was a symbol of escape, not just from the physical walls of the prison, but from the mental and emotional chains that tried to bind him. Every small act of hope was a step closer to freedom. Red granted Andy's request without hesitation, figuring Rita Hayworth was a big deal in the 1940s. Later, Andy encountered the sisters again, but this time, he stood up to them with surprising confidence. He warned them that he wasn't afraid to die and even threatened to bite off their manhood if they tried to touch him again. Taken aback by Andy's boldness, they decided not to test his resolve. However, they beat him severely, leaving him in the infirmary for a month. As a result, Boggs was put in solitary confinement, and when he was released, Hadley and his guards retaliated, beating him so badly that he became permanently disabled and was transferred to a prison hospital. The rest of Boggs' gang disbanded, leaving Andy in peace. When Andy finally returned from the infirmary, Red and the others gave him a set of sculpting rocks and a giant poster of Rita Hayworth. Soon after, Warden Samuel Norton learned of Andy's financial skills and arranged a surprise inspection of his cell, during which he introduced himself. He found Andy reading the Bible and discussed favorite verses while the guards tore through the cell looking for contraband. Finding nothing illegal, Norton encouraged Andy to keep reading, saying, "Salvation lies within." Norton's words carried more meaning than he realized. For Andy, the Bible wasn't just a book, it symbolized his inner freedom. No matter how tough Shawshank got, salvation would always lie within his ability to hope, to dream, to hold on to something bigger than the prison walls. Later, Andy was assigned to work in the prison library under Brooks Halton, an aging inmate. In exchange for his work, Andy offered financial advice to the guards, helping them with their taxes. As time passed, Andy became increasingly popular. Even guards from other prisons sought his services when they visited Shawshank for inter-prison baseball tournaments. Andy also became Norton's personal financial advisor. But one day, something snapped in Brooks. After spending 50 years behind bars, Brooks was scheduled for release, but the thought of freedom terrified him. Convinced that he wouldn't survive on the outside, Brooks took another inmate hostage, threatening to kill him. In the chaos, Andy stepped in and managed to calm him down, reminding him that there was still a world waiting for him beyond the prison walls. Later, Andy discussed the incident with Red, who observed that Brooks had become institutionalized. After spending most of his life in Shawshank, Brooks was no longer able to function in the outside world. Red explained that prison walls are funny. At first, you hate them, but over time, you get used to them, and eventually, you come to depend on them. This observation hit close to home for Red. But Andy's view of life was different. He refused to become dependent on Shawshank, or on any external circumstances. Andy had a belief that what truly defined a person wasn't where they were, but what they chose to believe in, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Andy Dufresne's story is one of hope, resilience, and the power of never giving up, even in the darkest of times. But here's the question for you: if you were in Andy's shoes, facing the challenges and hardships of Shawshank, do you think you could hold on to hope like he did? What would be your driving force to keep going? Share your thoughts in the comments below. What gives you hope when life gets tough? We'd love to hear your perspective. Brooks took a job at a local supermarket but found it impossible to keep up with the fast pace and the constant demands of the outside world. Everything around him seemed foreign and incomprehensible. Day by day, Brooks' depression deepened, and he became increasingly hopeless about his future. Unable to cope with the overwhelming change, Brooks ended his life, leaving behind a message: "Brooks was here," carved into a wooden beam. Brooks' tragic story served as a harsh reminder of the power of our minds. While the physical walls of Shawshank were easy to see, the mental walls that Brooks had built over the years were far more devastating. His story was one of missed opportunities, of never believing in the possibility of life beyond the bars. But Andy refused to allow that kind of thinking to define his own life. 6 long years passed, and Andy's persistence in writing letters to the state senate finally paid off. The prison received $200 to fund the expansion of the library, along with a collection of old books and phonograph records. Among them, Andy discovered a copy of Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro. Determined to share this masterpiece with his fellow inmates, Andy took a bold risk. While working in the warden's office, Andy locked a guard in the washroom and played the opera over the prison's loudspeaker system. As the notes of Mozart's music filled the air, something extraordinary happened. Even the hardest, most jaded prisoners were swept away by the beauty of the music. The guard smiled, the inmates closed their eyes, and for a brief moment, Shawshank felt like something other than a prison. For Andy, this wasn't just about music, it was about reminding everyone, including himself, that there was beauty, hope, and life beyond the walls. Even in Shawshank, even in the darkest of places, there was still a reason to believe in something more. The music was a symbol of freedom, a reminder that the world was still full of wonders, even if they couldn't see them from where they stood. Unfortunately, Andy's defiant act didn't go unnoticed. He was sentenced to 2 weeks in solitary confinement for his transgression. But despite the punishment, Andy remained firm in his belief that hope was the key to survival. He refused to let the brutal conditions of Shawshank break him. Solitary confinement may have locked away his body, but it couldn't touch his mind or his spirit. For Andy, hope was stronger than any prison cell. Sometime later, Red appeared before the parole board again, after having spent 30 years in prison. Once more, his request was denied. To lift Red's spirits, Andy gave him a harmonica to commemorate his 30 years in Shawshank. In return, Red gave Andy a giant poster of Marilyn Monroe to mark his 10-year anniversary in prison. These simple gestures were more than gifts, they were symbols of the bond between two men who had refused to let Shawshank strip away their humanity. After the Mozart incident, the state granted Andy an additional $500 to further expand the library. Andy used the funds wisely, signing deals with book clubs and charities to create the finest prison library in Maine, naming it after Brooks. With the improved infrastructure, Andy began tutoring inmates who wished to earn their high school diplomas, giving them a shot at a better life once released. Through this, Andy's determination and kindness gave the inmates a glimpse of hope, a sense that their lives could still have meaning beyond Shawshank's walls. Andy wasn't just changing lives, he was restoring faith, one book and one diploma at a time. Meanwhile, the warden was enriching himself by exploiting Andy's knowledge. Norton began using the prisoners as cheap labor for public projects, outbidding competitors by offering unbeatable prices. Andy set up accounts in various banks using the identity of a fictional man named Randall Stevens to hide Norton's illicit earnings. Although Stevens didn't exist, he had a birth certificate, a social security number, and a driver's license, all forged by Andy. In 1965, a young inmate named Tommy was sentenced to Shawshank for burglary. Tommy was charismatic and had been in and out of jail since he was 13. He quickly befriended Andy and Red, and the three formed a close bond. One day, Tommy asked Andy to help him earn his high school diploma, and Andy gladly agreed. During a conversation with Red, Tommy revealed something that would change everything. He had once shared a cell with a man who confessed to murdering a woman and framing an innocent banker for it. The realization hit Andy like a ton of bricks, he was the innocent banker. Andy approached the warden with the new information, hoping for a retrial with Tommy as a witness. But the corrupt warden, fearing the loss of his profitable scheme, refused to help and had Tommy killed to silence him. Devastated by the betrayal, Andy was placed in solitary confinement for a month as punishment. When Andy was released, the warden visited him and falsely claimed that Tommy had been killed while trying to escape. Andy didn't believe it and refused to continue laundering money for Norton. In response, the warden threatened to shut down the library and undo everything Andy had built if he stopped cooperating. Andy was at a crossroads: continue to live under Norton's thumb or take a chance on his dream of freedom. One night, Andy confided in Red, opening up about the deep regret he carried over the death of his wife. He explained how his work and ambition had driven her away and how, despite not pulling the trigger, he felt responsible for her death. Overcome with emotion, Andy revealed his ultimate dream to Red: to escape Shawshank and live in the small beach town of Zihuatanejo, Mexico. He even invited Red to join him someday. This moment wasn't just about escaping Shawshank, it was about reclaiming a life lost to regret and pain. Andy's dream of Zihuatanejo symbolized hope, not just for freedom, but for healing. It was a place where he could finally forgive himself and move forward. And in a world where dreams were hard to come by, Andy's dream was powerful enough to keep him going. Andy told Red that he had hidden something in a specific location in Buxton, Maine, and asked him to retrieve it when he was released. As the days passed, Red grew increasingly worried about Andy, especially after learning that Andy had asked a fellow inmate for a 6-foot length of rope. Fearing the worst, Red assumed Andy might be contemplating suicide. But this wasn't about giving up. For Andy, this was about something far greater. It was about finally stepping into the freedom he had always believed in, the kind of freedom that begins not outside the walls, but inside your own heart. Andy's actions weren't driven by despair, they were driven by hope, the hope that someday, he would walk free, not just from Shawshank, but from the guilt and pain that had haunted him. The next morning, Andy didn't respond to the usual morning roll call. His cell was empty, and the guards were baffled. It wasn't until they pulled back the poster of Raquel Welch that they discovered a hole in the wall, revealing that Andy had dug a tunnel over the course of 2 decades using the rock hammer Red had smuggled in for him years earlier. Flashbacks revealed that Andy had been meticulously planning his escape for years, slowly chipping away at the wall and emptying the dirt into the courtyard during his daily walks. The night before, Andy had packed the warden's illegal papers and clothes into a plastic bag, tying it to himself with the rope. While everyone in Shawshank was sleeping, Andy crawled through the tunnel, broke through the prison's sewage pipe, and emerged a free man. Andy's escape wasn't just an act of defiance, it was the physical manifestation of years of patience, hope, and quiet perseverance. While others had resigned themselves to their fate, Andy had always kept his eyes on the horizon, believing that freedom was possible. His escape wasn't just about leaving Shawshank, it was about proving that hope, no matter how small, could move mountains. After escaping, Andy visited several of Norton's banks, posing as Randall Stevens, and withdrew all the warden's hidden money. He also mailed evidence of Norton's crimes to the press. Chaos ensued at Shawshank as the police and media descended on the prison. Captain Hadley was arrested for the murder of Tommy, and other corrupt officials were taken into custody. Before the police could arrest him, Norton took his own life to avoid the shame of being exposed. Justice had finally been served, and Andy's legacy became a symbol of hope and perseverance in the face of injustice. His escape wasn't just for himself, it was a reminder to everyone who had ever felt trapped that freedom, in all its forms, was worth fighting for. Sometime later, Red received an anonymous postcard from Fort Hancock, Texas. His heart raced with excitement as he realized it was from Andy, who had finally made it to his dream destination, Zihuatanejo. Red felt a mix of emotions. He was overjoyed that Andy had achieved his long-held dream of freedom but saddened that he might never see his friend again. As Red stared at the postcard, he recalled Andy's words, "Some birds aren't meant to be caged, their feathers are too bright." Red smiled through his tears, knowing that Andy was one of those birds. He was grateful for the time they had shared and for the lessons Andy had taught him about hope. It was those lessons that had kept Red alive, that had made him believe that maybe, just maybe, there was something more for him too. The scene shifted to Red's final parole hearing in 1967. This time, he didn't bother trying to impress the board. Instead, he spoke frankly, admitting that rehabilitation was just a word invented to justify the board's existence. He expressed genuine remorse for his past actions but told them that no words could ever change what he had done. In the end, Red asked the board to stop wasting his time and leave him alone. To his surprise, Red's parole was granted. He was sent to live in the same halfway house where Brooks had stayed after his release. Like Brooks, Red found work at the same supermarket. There were moments when he felt tempted to commit a crime just to return to prison, but each time, he remembered the promise he had made to Andy. Eventually, Red traveled to Buxton and found the stone wall Andy had mentioned. Beneath it, he uncovered a small box containing a large sum of cash and a letter from Andy, inviting him to join him in Zihuatanejo. Andy wrote that he was eager to see him again and could use Red's help with a project. At that moment, Red realized the true power of hope. Before leaving, he carved a message into the wooden beam at the halfway house, which now read, "Brooks was here, so was Red." Despite violating his parole, Red felt a sense of liberation as he crossed the border at Fort Hancock, leaving behind the oppressive past that had weighed him down for so long. He looked forward to reuniting with Andy and starting a new adventure. Andy had given him the greatest gift of all, the strength to believe in a better tomorrow. Andy and Red reunite on a sun-drenched beach on the Pacific coast, ready to embrace the future. It's not just a reunion of two friends, it's a celebration of hope, perseverance, and the belief that no matter how far gone you may feel, there's always a way forward if you hold on to hope. Andy Dufresne's journey is a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Through his unwavering hope and determination, he overcame unimaginable adversity. His story reminds us that no matter how dark our situation, hope is something no one can take away from us. As Andy once said, hope is a good thing, maybe the best of things, and no good thing ever dies. And that's what Andy showed us, hope can endure, even in the darkest of places, and it is the one thing that can truly set us free. If you liked this story, you have to watch the next one, which talks about a different kind of imprisonment.